Hi, my name is Alexander Garganta, and today we're breaking open Dart with Seth Ladd, who is the developer advocate on the Dart project.
Thanks for having me.
So Seth, tell us a little bit about yourself. What brought you to the project? What makes you be the developer advocate for Dart?
Good question. So I got my start programming many years ago with C and kind of jumped in the deep end there. And so when I heard about Java as an easier way to, I think, approach software development, I was all over it. But also because it worked really well in a web browser, at least at that time. Also, Java had first-class support for things like network access and web access and loading bytecode over a URL. I mean, this is really, really cool ideas at the time. So if I could take kind of my experience with structured programming and apply it to the web, I was all over it. And so I did a lot of Java programming, moved on to Ruby, again, still working with classes and objects. Then I was lucky enough to get this job at Chrome, which was really great, except I wasn't an experienced JavaScript ninja, if you will. So I was a little concerned, but I did get up to speed really quickly on HTML5 and JavaScript and learned about how totally awesome the modern web platform is. But all this time, I was still missing just a little bit kind of my structured programming experience and expectations. So when I heard about the Dart project, I was all over it because I could combine my structured experience and expectations with deploying modern apps on the modern web. It sounded perfect.
Cool. How long ago was this?
Let's see, I joined a little over a year ago. We had our public launch about a year ago.
OK, so right at the beginning, pretty much.
A little bit, yeah.
OK, cool. So you brought up this term structured, and that seems to be the way you guys describe Dart. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about Dart and why this structured nature of Dart is so important?
Sure. So it's important to remember that as you scale up in the complexity and number of team members that are working on some of these projects, you need to have I believe you need to have certain things baked into the language to help you scale up from 10 lines of code to 100 lines of code to 1,000. Then when you start to go into 10,000 and 100,000, which really isn't that unusual when you think of the really large apps like Gmails and Facebooks and Twitters and Google+. We're talking very large teams, lots and lots of code. When you reach that kind of scale, you need certain things like classes or libraries or modules, things that help you kind of partition and structure that code so you can go bigger and bigger. I think you cross this point where it's too much to keep in your head, and you need tools that help you navigate that code and refactor that code and just evolve to the very large. And so we're building Dart to help developers start small, like every web developer does, open up a file, add some functions, but then grow over time to classes, and then libraries, and then 10 developers, and 100 developers. And so we think that structure to help you scale is very important.
Right. So I'm kind of hearing scale. I see structure is a way of bringing about scale, right? And so does that kind of imply that it's mostly geared towards very large enterprise projects, or do people that are building smaller sites also benefit from essentially the structure?
I think both. I think especially the way we envision web developers growing over time, that is their apps. You always start with a small idea. A lot of startups, start with that seed, the minimum viable product, just enough to get you going. But then you listen to the feedback of your community, and you refactor the code as you grow, and you can grow up to the very large. And it's not just really about lines of code or number of people on the team. It's also about how do you take advantage of the wide array of modern HTML5 features like WebGL and Canvas and WebRTC and WebAudio and file system. And this list goes on and on. The more complexity you add into the app, even if it's not just pure lines of code, but just the more features you need to add, the more I believe that you need more structure so you can employ encapsulation and give your tools that kind of knowledge and insight in your program so that you don't get overwhelmed by that complexity. And make no mistake, we need to add this kind of complexity. We need to move beyond just dynamic websites, if you will. When new platforms launch, the first thing every user says is, where are the apps? I want these apps to be beautiful and functional and silky smooth and takes advantage of all the hardware. That's the thing I think that really motivates us. And how can we help more developers do that with the web platform? That's what keeps us going every day.
Can you tell us a little bit about JavaScript? Obviously this is the big question that everyone's talking about is Dart out there to replace JavaScript? Is it to complement JavaScript? Are Dart geared towards larger, more scalable, or essentially projects that require more scale? is essentially, are they going to coexist? What's the relationship between the two?
Sure, they're definitely going to coexist. We see JavaScript becoming almost the assembly language of the web. I mean, it's probably the most popular language with a tremendous amount of installs across all these devices. And so it's going to be around, right? But we've seen that it's helpful to introduce other ways to write apps for web that compile to JavaScript. We see Emscripten as a way to get like C and C++ into JavaScript. CoffeeScript is another syntax. We see TypeScript as a way to compile into JavaScript. We see Dart as a way to compile into JavaScript. And so
GWT.
GWT compiling into JavaScript. And all these things, just what they do is they bring more developers to the web. And that's a good thing. I mean, if in the end of the day, all we've done is help more developers build more complex, awesome apps for the web, that's a great thing. And so this is a very much an and world. It's not an or world at all. There's a lot of fantastic developers with JavaScript, and there's a lot of fantastic developers with Java and C# and ActionScript, et cetera, as well. Everyone should be building for the web. And so we found that Dart has been really appealing to some of those other developers.
Mm-hmm. But tell us a little bit about the performance aspects of it. Specifically, one of the ways I kind of see Dart and JavaScript differing is the fact that, based on how the Dart has been put together, class-based, optional static typing and whatnot, that can lead to much better performance of the VM. And so does that mean that down the road you'll want to, essentially take advantage or leverage these features and improve the performance by having essentially a natively provided VM? How does that factor into the equation? Like, do you see compiling to JavaScript, or is the ultimate goal running it natively?
The ultimate goal is to enable better apps for the modern web. And so compiling to JavaScript is a first-class concern. In fact, I think there's two core tenets to designing the Dart language. One, it has to be, very quickly familiar and recognizable. This is not a chance, or we didn't use this chance to introduce an esoteric syntax or anything. Like this thing, you have to look at it and say, I get what you're doing. And we've seen this with hackathons. People get up and running in just a couple hours. But the other major core tenet of the language design is that it has to compile to sane and logical JavaScript, because that is our #1 deployment platform for the foreseeable future. Certainly we have a Dart virtual machine as well. I do want to say, like, some of the optional static types and the classes, some of those things don't necessarily flow into just performance features necessarily. But by starting with a fresh, kind of clean slate, and by eliminating some of the supreme dynamicism that's available in other languages like JavaScript and Ruby, and so pulling back a little bit on that, I think is one of the things that's really helping us get extreme performance as well. But really, at the end of the day, Dart has to compile to logical JavaScript that runs as close to the JavaScript engine on the different browsers will allow it to run.
Okay, and what about, do you have any sort of performance numbers that you can share with us in terms of, say, I don't know what sort of algorithm or sort of benchmarks you guys have. What is the performance of the most optimal code natively implemented in JavaScript versus one implemented in Dart that compiles to JavaScript versus one that potentially would work directly on your VM?
Yeah, so as you might know, the co-founders of the Dart project also were the co-founders of Chrome's fast JavaScript engine, V8. And they also have a long lineage, a pedigree of building virtual machines for other platforms. And so if these guys do anything, it's about performance and speed. We don't have any public numbers just quite yet, because we're still really early. One thing I can say is that the Dart VM is beating V8 on a couple benchmarks now, and we expect to be able to do quite well in this area. In fact, there's a benchmarking Dart article on our website if you're interested in that. And we have more work to do on the virtual machine, more work to do on Dart2JS, which is a compiler to JavaScript. But these guys are all about speed, and so I'm feeling very good about what we're going to be able to do for the 1.0, 2.0, et cetera releases of Dart. And so that brings me to the next question: where you see kind of the industry, with respect to native support for Dart VM, specifically browser vendors. Yeah. I know there were some concerns expressed by, say, folks from Mozilla on support for Dart, and saying that, hey, the only way Dart is viable is if there is a native VM. Yeah, so we definitely we have differing views about that. Okay. What's really fantastic about the web platform is it's that full name open web platform, and that I interpret that open as people can introduce ideas to the web, test out their viability, and see if they really help drive the web forward. And we've seen other people unilaterally launch features for the modern web before, things like Canvas At the time, only Safari had it, no other browser had it, and there was a lot of kind of skepticism around this feature. Fast forward to today, and you can't imagine the modern HTML5 world without Canvas. I mean, it's so fantastic. But somebody had to just step up and say, we think that the web needs, say, a drawing surface. Let's see what that means. We think that more developers should be able to come to the web by building in a language and with tools that are just much more familiar and meet and exceed their particular expectations. So the nice thing is, Dart's success isn't predicated on the VM actually getting into all these different browsers. Again, it goes back to our compiling to JavaScript, right? As long as we do a good job compiling to JavaScript, where a good job is defined as we can get that code small and fast, then we think it doesn't really matter as long as those other browsers continue to increase the speed of their JavaScript VMs, and which obviously they're doing. Great, thanks to all the great competition and friendly benchmarks out there. That helps Dart. That just helps the web.
So you think this whole argument around, for example, the presence of Dart VM fragmenting essentially the web by having some browsers support it, some browsers don't support, not supporting it, and offering suboptimal user experience is basically doesn't.
So I'm not sure what suboptimal user experience is, because as long
meaning
as
being slower.
Well, again, it's only as fast as the JavaScript engine allows it to be, right? And again, because there are a tremendous amount of JavaScript engines out there. We compile Dart to JavaScript and make that small and fast, then we've done a good job and developers will use it.
Now, let's come back to this. You mentioned open, and actually that seems to be another thing that comes up in the developer community, saying that, for example, like Android, being open source, it's all great, but it's being developed essentially behind closed doors. So a lot of the design decisions, requirements, are not necessarily visible until after the fact, and others don't really have ways of contributing or offering contributions to the project until you guys have already kind of put it in stone. So can you address that? Can you tell us a little bit about your development process? How do you go about essentially listening not just to your own core developer community at Google, but kind of reaching out to others and incorporating their feedback into the future of Dart?
Sure. This is an area that I feel very passionate about, especially as a developer advocate. My job really is to be that liaison between the community and the engineering team, and engineering team back to the community. And so, yeah, I'm right in the middle of it. And I'm very happy with how the Dart project has evolved. It is totally open source. It's a BSD, very permissive license. We're open in spirit and in name and in day-to-day operations. So you can track the issue tracker. You can follow along in the mailing list. In fact, I just posted our build bot. So you can see every commit and how it trickles through the waterfall of builds. You can see when someone has an error in their commit and exactly what unit test failed. I mean, we're that open. And the other nice thing is we have external committers, which is really great. So these are people that have contributed to the Dart project in some fashion, and we've shepherded their patches through and said, okay, you've clearly shown that you're really passionate about this and do a really good job. We're going to flip that commit bit for you. We've taken numerous just patches from the community. In fact, you can go to our authors file, and we call out every contributor, which is really nice. We also have the ancillary satellite projects on GitHub. And so you can fork it and send pull requests, which we've done for everything from Pub, our package manager, to the website itself, to our articles, to our Dart JavaScript interop, to our web components work. And so it's really cool to see the community not just get interested and excited and use Dart, but actually contribute back to Dart. And the more we can help shepherd their patches in, the more I think we really live and breathe that open source nature. I mean, you have to look at Dart comes out of the Chrome project. The Chrome project is a kind of a reflection of the open web. This is just how it's done in the web world. And so we're very comfortable and happy to do it.
Couple of questions. One is, you obviously are opening the project to committers, but not necessarily the design process, right?
So not necessarily. So
okay, so can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, on the mailing list, you can see lots of great discussions around language features, language syntax, library designs. Those will often evolve into feature requests and bugs on the issue tracker, and then we milestone them. So obviously, languages designed by committee probably aren't always the best thing.
Understood.
But we have definitely rolled things back. We've added things. We've clarified things in the spec. And so it's because we have that active community participation have we been able to move, I think, as fast as we can, because we get that feedback almost instantaneously. I mean, we have weekly releases. So people are like, here's the bugs, here's how I think it could change. I'd like the editor to do X for us. Great, file the bug, and we're on it. And so, yeah, I do see a collaboration there. And it's not just the community on the mailing list, to be clear. I mean, we have the engineers and the language designers, they're also participating on the list as well.
Can you tell us a bit more about kind of maybe share some numbers or at least percentages? Like, so how quickly is this community growing? What percentage of developers roughly are external versus internal? And kind of how is this, I know that some of these numbers you may not be able to tell
Well, it's
me.
also really hard. I'm not sure how to measure that stuff. And we can look at things like followers and number of bugs. But I think what's really key, I think the metric that I'm most interested in, how many packages are being published into our package manager. So Dart is much more than a language. We have all of these projects as well to give you a complete picture of developing. We have the editor, we have the libraries, we have a compiler, JavaScript, a virtual machine. But we also have a package management system. Like Ruby has Gems and Java has Maven. Dart has Pub, because you play darts at a pub,
Right.
of course. So not only is it just a series of scripts that help you discover and install and manage third-party dependencies, but it's also a website where you can upload your own packages for other people to use. And to me, that's I think, the real bellwether of Dart adoption. I don't have actual numbers with me, but anyone can go to pub.dartlang.org and click through, and you'll see packages for, say, MongoDB, which is obviously a database, and you'll see templating languages, and you'll see the Dart JavaScript interop. We even put our own packages up there, treat them just equal like anyone else. That's really where I'm really excited for the community to participate and upload and share their work. Vector math stuff, Box2D, the list goes on and on.
And you're seeing a growing number of packages. So.
Yes. In fact, we're scrambling to allow developers to publish their own packages. That's in our next milestone. So we're doing the upload for them right now. And I can tell you, nothing motivates us more than seeing the tremendous amount of bugs. Like, please upload my package. Please upload my package. Like, OK, we'll get the self-published done really quickly.
So tell us what other metrics do you guys use? Like, how do you know you're on the right track? Like, what other things are you looking at, or who are you talking to in order to essentially know what you're doing is making sense?
Yeah, sure. Well, adoption in terms of, are people launching more packages with Dart is really great to see. Are people providing feedback? We have an editor with a big send feedback button, so we love to see those. That is, if people are using the editor and they send the feedback. We love to see just participation on, say, our Google Plus feed. That's really, really nice. We look at that and say, are people joining in on the conversation? Are people sharing what they are doing with Dart, with, say, #Dartlang on Google Plus and Twitter? So just keeping a finger on the pulse of the community and seeing what they produce in terms of packages and apps. GitHub is another good way. I mean, this is pretty common with most open source projects. Just monitoring where we are with a number of open source GitHub projects that use Dart is just a really cool way to see what people are doing.
Cool. And so speaking of open source, obviously open source community is usually quick to adopt these sorts of things just because it's nature of who we are. But what about commercial vendors? Like, do you see actually professional IT teams in, say, Fortune 5000s playing with Dart, potentially even using it in some?
We've definitely seen
projects?
people trying and playing with it. We see a lot of interest from the GWT community looking for, say, a next generation way to build scalable web apps. So that's really interesting. It's probably fair to say we're in very early stages with Dart. And so we don't have all these kind of pieces that these guys need, but it's really encouraging to see them come to the meetups, come to the presentations, and tell us, yes, this is something we're interested in. We've also been talking to other vendors that help flush out just the ecosystem in general. So we've talked to Drone.io. They have a CI, continuous integration server, that will test your Dart code, which is really fantastic.
Cool.
So that's great. We've talked to library authors and vendors creating, Rikulo is one that it's all built in Dart, and they target mobile and desktop modern web apps, and it's a professional toolkit. So that's really encouraging. And some others I can't talk about right now, but yeah, we're starting to see people flush out the ecosystem, people try it out, and send that feedback. So it's really great.
So speaking of trying it out, how far are you guys from dogfooding essentially Dart at Google? Specifically on
we have
larger
internal
projects?
teams. Yeah, we have internal teams using Dart right now. Nobody I can say publicly, which is great. And again, just really it validates our ideas that this is a good way to build these larger, scalable apps. And Google does nothing if they don't do really large web apps. And so to see internal teams check it out and work with us is really, really nice.
You also mentioned GWT or PWT. I understand that that's basically been your platform of choice for things like Gmail and the like.
So I'm not sure how or if it's used in Gmail or not, but it is true that there are a lot of Google's apps and sites out there are built with GWT.
Basically, then the question is, how do you see GWT coexisting with Dart?
Absolutely. Coexist is the right word here. So GWT is transitioning to a consortium led by a lot of the key stakeholders in GWT, which is great. Again, just more open now, more community involvement. And GWT is a very mature platform. It does a lot of things really, really well. And so if you have an existing investment in GWT, that's fantastic. If you're looking at the next thing, you might be interested in Dart as a way to evolve and maybe move quicker. But it's very much a coexisting. And we love that there's options out there, and that's a good thing. So if you're not happy with GWT, you may try Dart. If you're not happy with Dart, you may try GWT. As long as you are developing awesome apps for the modern web, that's a win for everybody.
But in terms of like just within Google, do you foresee kind of time where the existing GWT-based installations are going to be migrating to Dart, or new projects are going to be recommended to go to Dart? I mean,
so Google's an interesting place, right? It's very bottom up, and so we would love to see that as the Dart team. More teams check out Dart, of course. But it's up to them to get excited, and all I know is that we're talking to a bunch of teams, they're really interested, and I know of early adopters inside Google, and so that's a good sign.
So you basically have to sell Dart not only outside of Google, but within the company
Yes,
as well.
Google is, again, very grassroots organization. We have to sell them as well, yes.
One thing about Dart, you mentioned the ecosystem, which is actually quite impressive, especially around the IDs and whatnot. You guys have really put a lot of effort into that.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit more about the specific features of the language that you are most proud of, and how they essentially address the shortcomings of, or let's not use these shortcomings, but let's say the rough around the edges parts of JavaScript.
I like to think of what are the features of the language that are really interesting to help developers be more productive. I think most languages have their place, and I really believe in this polyglot world out there. And so what makes Dart more unique and interesting to me, a couple of features like optional static types. This really plays into the scalability story. Let's put it this way. So if you're just starting a web app, and you just have a couple functions. Well, at this point in time, you're just playing around. You're not worrying about type hierarchies. You're not worried about, is this an abstract factory, class factory, or whatever. You just want to get the thing running. And so you don't have to worry about appeasing some ceremonial type checker. But at a certain point, as you add more features, you move into classes, and you pull in more developers, and you get more comfortable with the structure of the program, then you can start adding these optional static type annotations throughout your code, which it's more like inline documentation. It gives feedback to the tools. So the tool can do things like refactor for you or give you more warnings before you actually run the program and hit the problem. But it also gives you kind of call site documentation for other developers, which is important as you scale up to, say, 50 developers or 100 developers. Like, you can't convey the information fast enough or concisely enough unless it's kind of right there in the code. Now, of course, you can be like, well, hopefully the developer put it in comments, but then the comments can be really long, and then the tools aren't reading the comments. And anyway, so we believe that you add these type annotations right there in the code to give that kind of feedback and flexibility. So I really love that feature. I'm really liking the way we handle concurrency, which is through an isolate model. And so we've taken lessons learned from other platforms that you can do shared memory threads, but they lead to deadlocks, and they're really hard to debug, and they require then things like locks and mutexes and just way more complexity. So we took a cue from Erlang and probably others and said, well, what if we actually shared no state between these separate little running bits of code? And instead just pass messages. And if you're not sharing state, then you can't have two threads kind of clobber each other and get into deadlocks. Oh, okay, we like this model. Especially because JavaScript itself is a single-threaded execution model. So again, going back to we can't design anything into the language that can't compile the same JavaScript. Dart has to kind of play in that world. And so we took these kind of cues and built a system we call isolates. An isolate is an isolated memory heap, or a logically isolated memory heap that can run in a separate thread or a separate process. Kind of depends on the implementation. And you pass messages back and forth between these different isolates. Much like Erlang and its actors. Much like web workers and JavaScript, you might fire off a web worker and pass messages back and forth. So I really love this concurrency model, and this whole posting messages back and forth and maybe moving an isolate between different virtual machines, or using the isolate abstraction between the web browser and the server, or two isolates in the same VM. I mean, the abstraction seems to scale to all these different approaches, which is really cool to me. So. There's other esoteric features, but those are the two big ones I really like.
Of course, the object-oriented being kind of properly done, being class-based as opposed to
Well,
prototype-based
properly or not,
language.
it is a class-based
Right.
object-oriented system, which is very familiar to developers. So it's less sexy, but it's the thing that I think everyone was like, okay, I totally get this. You look at JavaScript libraries, a lot of them implement these class systems, and that's because a lot of developers want them. But it's hard to then interoperate between these different JavaScript libraries because the class is more like a convention, right? Whereas Dart bakes it into the language. Now, of course, you can have frameworks built on top of frameworks much more easily, and your tools can tell if you're trampling on each other. So certainly the class-based and library-based approach to structure is another good one. But probably another really good one, if we're on the subject, is lexical scoping, which is fantastic.
Right.
So that the visibility or the access of the variable is you can determine simply by just looking at the code, right? Statically analyzing it and just using your eyes. So it's different than function scope or dynamically scoping the variables. And that's one of those things a little tricky as people move to traditional web programming, but it's very logical and straightforward in Dart. And the fact that we have lexically scoped closures makes it even easier and cooler. And so things just kind of work. Like this is lexically scoped, which is a very logical approach to it.
So that brings me to the next question. Who do you find Dart is specifically well suited to? Like, so who are the developers that are most open to this? I'm assuming folks that come from structured languages.
Yeah. Well, so we've done some surveys with some of the meetups and conferences we've done, and it's kind of all over the map. We see some spikes with people who would say they're proficient in Java, JavaScript, C#, and ActionScript are the seemingly big kind of pools of developers that are attracted, at least in a kind of curious manner, to what Dart is doing. And so that's good. We wanted to be very familiar and approachable, and to see multiple spikes, I think, in the survey answers says we're on the right track there.
Do you ever get into a situation where essentially people say that JavaScript is just good enough? You say it's the assembly language of the web, and there's a lot of people that seem pretty well versed in JavaScript, especially when you take into account like modern frameworks like jQuery and whatnot.
Sure.
So how do you convince them to at least consider Dart, if not even start using it?
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sure we need to get, success of Dart isn't every developer is now using Dart. And so I'm more interested in tackling the higher level problem of how do we get more developers building more interesting apps for the modern web? And so if you have the developers with 15 years of hardcore web development experience and know all the subtle ins and outs and are doing it, in other words, doing a great job already, that's fantastic. And especially, we've seen them accelerate their velocity even faster thanks to frameworks like Backbone and Ember and Angular, adding structure to their programming again, which is always really important, or tools like Clojure, which allows you to annotate via comments, but annotate your code so that you can have things like linters and static analyzers help you kind of bust through that ceiling of what you could fit in your head and what your tools can think about for you. And that's great. Like we want them to continue doing a good job. So what I think we can continue to demonstrate just in general for all developers is our increased performance, increased productivity, certainly just with the language design in terms of the tools, like just being able to refactor, just being able to right-click on a method and say, show me everywhere where this is used.
Right.
I mean, these are things that I'm used to in my past
Clips,
life.
right.
So yeah, sure, or IntelliJ or whatever. But when you bust through, again, that kind of artificial barrier, you need the tools to be like, where was this called? And who else is calling this? Can I delete this? Can I rename it? Can I move it? So really enhanced productivity is something I think that will turn people on to Dart as well.
What about speaking of productivity? What about the Harmony project? Basically, the next version of JavaScript, with classes being kind of first-class citizens all over again.
I think from a syntactic point, right? It's still a prototypal inheritance, but I think they're adding in syntax or syntactic sugar to build a class. Yeah.
Do you feel that kind of JavaScript is fundamentally, again, I'm going to use the word flawed, although some people are going to object to that, but
Yeah.
so flawed in a sense that, being able to scale the way modern structured languages can, and essentially scale, to offer larger teams ability to productively work on larger, deployments.
I can just tell you what I've seen at Google, in that we built tools like Clojure and Gwt to help us scale out to larger teams and larger code bases. And so it's really nice to see the JavaScript community look at things like structured frameworks, look at things like new syntaxes for JavaScript to help them do even more for the web. I think what's really cool, though, is by taking a fresher approach with Dart and saying, OK, if we can do this kind of from scratch, taking cues from other platforms and languages, what else can we do? How fast can we move? Can we meet and exceed more user expectations with not just syntax and scalability, but just like pure language semantics and productivity as well?
Okay, got it. Well, we're approaching the end of this episode, but I wanted to ask you kind of where is Dart today in terms of completeness, and where do you see it going in the next, short and obviously long term?
Yes.
Just as an, essentially, how do you convince developers that Dart is a viable platform, that Google is invested in it, that it's not gonna, go wave on it,
Yeah.
and that in 3, 4, 5 years, it's gonna be here to stay.
Sure. Well, I can say that it's a serious investment in Google in terms of headcount and locations and number of projects. We have offices around the world working on this from all different aspects: language, libraries, compiler, JavaScript, package manager, editor, the website, docs. The list goes on. So this is not just about, hey, what would happen if we looked at another language? It's, hey, let's make a serious investment into making a more productive and performant platform for modern web developers. And that means pulling in all these other aspects into the platform. So I think that's a really fantastic sign. The sign that internal teams are using Dart today is a really good sign. The fact that we see our community growing in terms of releasing packages and participating in the mailing list and issue tracker is a really fantastic sign. So we should say that recently we had an M1 release, which is our first release as we moved out of technology preview. So we launched a year ago, where we had things basically compiling and working, but it was really released to say, what's your feedback, community? We had really awesome feedback. And then we put out the M1, which said, OK, we added in the extra pieces of the platform that you need, like the package manager and more robust editor. And we took a look at the language. We said, OK, we think the language is baked enough that we're not going to break backwards compatibility, unless, of course, there's some massive bug or something. But so it's a safety net now for developers, even more developers, to come on and try out Dart. We'll have other milestones as we approach a 1.0, but right now is a really good time because we have a much more robust and stable language platform for developers to try.
And let's say in a year or two, can you expect to see a 1.0 release with some major
timelines are really, really hard to predict, unfortunately. But I can say that we're moving really fast, and I feel like this team is very aggressive. So I don't feel like this is something that's going to stretch on for very long. So I think that if you've got feedback, you want stuff, ask us now because this train is moving really fast.
Right, and you're just to also clarify this, you guys are focused mostly on the client side, mostly on the Dart to JavaScript. Server side is an option, but it certainly is
that's a good clarification, right? So because we have a standalone Dart virtual machine, we can of course embed that into browsers, like we have done today with Dartium, which is a build of Chromium that has a Dart VM built in, and that facilitates really fantastic edit reload cycles, something that's hard to achieve, I think, in other platforms. That you can go in the editor, write some code, just hit reload, and without recompiling anything, just relaunches into Dartium. You can then set breakpoints in the editor, and it will stop the running program in Dartium, which is really fantastic. So just to have that kind of VM-level debug integration in your tools in an editor that a lot of people are familiar with, I think will help a lot of developers get excited. Speaking of the editor, we also are friends with IntelliJ, and they have Dart editor, a plugin for IntelliJ and WebStorm as well, which is
looks
really
awesome.
Cool. But going back to the virtual machine, it does run standalone on the command line. You can access files and directories, web servers, web sockets. You can even deploy a server-side Dart app to Heroku, which is really cool. So we do envision this end-to-end world, which obviously all great things turn on. We've seen from the JavaScript community when you have Node.js on the server and obviously JavaScript on the client. We've seen Gwt when you have Java on the back end and Java compiled to JavaScript. We see the same thing for Dart. So we are focused on the client, but the server piece is coming along nicely.
Yeah, awesome. Before I let you go, one last question. What else are you passionate about? When you're not out there selling Dart, what makes you tick?
What makes me think? Well, I love playing games, board games that is, and card games. So I've been playing like Dominion and Settlers Catan. So I'm really into that stuff, and photography. So just taking pictures and pretending I'm a professional photographer.
Cool, cool.
Of course I'm not, but.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. This was really inspirational. I'm definitely excited personally about Dart. I know there's still a lot of kind of kind of mini controversy around some of the things that happened over the years, but it definitely seems
it
like
happens.
it's got
This is the life cycle of adoption of
Right.
every. This is not unique to Dart. You introduce something new to communities. They have to kind of rationalize and contextualize it, and of course, new things scare people. And then we just keep listening to the feedback, keep improving the platform, and then you get to that tipping point, and so great things start to happen. So we're optimistic and excited.
Thank you.
Thank you.